That coat should be donated instead. On a holiday you dress like this, the words cut through the morning cafe loud enough for others to hear, cold enough to make the air sink. It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. A judgment aimed at the old man sitting in his usual booth, a worn jacket resting on his shoulders, a faded patch showing just enough to invite scrutiny. He didn't answer. He didn't look up. He didn't show irritation. The coffee cup stayed where it was. The newspaper remained open as if the remark had never existed. But the voice didn't stop. It continued lighter, more mocking. Was that patch even real or just for show? It looked so worn, no one probably remembers what it was ever for. No one laughed. No one spoke. People around them suddenly found themselves busy with their coffee cups, their spoons, their eyes turning away. That silence wasn't agreement. It was hesitation. No one wanted to step into the middle. The old man slowly folded his newspaper. Carefully. Deliberately. He set it aside, still not looking toward the speaker. Not because he was weak, but because he had nothing to prove. Some people have lived through too much to explain who they are. And that silence, heavier than any rebuttal, began to change the room even before anyone realized it. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Samuel left the cafe without leaving a single word behind. No rebuttal. No explanation. The door closed so softly that no one noticed, yet the silence he carried with him lingered for a long time, settling among the uncleared tables and the glances still hanging in the air. Some people walk away not because they've lost, but because they're long past the need to stop and prove anything. He went straight to the town's memorial cemetery, a place where names carved in stone had grown more accustomed to silence than anywhere else. Samuel bent down before a headstone and used an old cloth to wipe away the thin layer of dust on the stone's surface. He didn't rush. Each pass of the cloth was firm and deliberate, like a proper greeting. The small flag planted in front of the grave leaned slightly. He adjusted it straight, balanced. A flower was placed just close enough, not too much, not out of line. These were motions ingrained deep into his hands, his eyes, his breathing. At a respectful distance, Martha Lee watched. She had worked in this town long enough to know that some people don't need to be asked. She leaned towards someone beside her, lowering her voice as if afraid to disturb the names on the stone. He does this every year. No one asks him to. The sentence was short, yet it carried a truth longer than any explanation. No name badge. No volunteer list. Just the steady presence of a man who had never forgotten anyone. Samuel moved from one headstone to the next. At each one, he paused for exactly the time it required. Not longer. Not quicker. Every name was treated the same. None mattered more than another. To him, they had all once stood in the same line in places where life and death never recognized rank. Footsteps sounded behind him. Jason appeared, papers in hand, and a badge hanging from his chest. He stopped a few steps away from Samuel, his voice carefully measured. The area was being prepared for the ceremony. Only those with volunteer credentials were allowed to remain. It was policy. The words came out neatly, like reading a printed line. Jason didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it either. He was doing his job, at least as he understood it. Samuel turned. He looked at Jason for a brief moment, just long enough to recognize not hostility, but a young man clinging to the one thing that made him feel certain. Samuel nodded. Just a nod. No questions. No argument. He bent down to finish the last task before him, straightening the flower he had just placed, smoothing the flag, resting his hand on the stone for a very brief moment, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. Then he stood, brushed his hands lightly, didn't look back. Left no trace except what he had set right. He walked away slowly, his back still slightly bent, but his steps steady, as if what he did there wasn't an exception, but simply a part of his life for a very long time. Jason remained still. He watched him go. At first, there was the irritation of being ignored, but as the distance grew, that feeling lost its footing. A question formed in his mind, one that had never had a place there before. If no one asked him, why did he keep coming back? If he didn't need recognition, why did he do these things so faithfully? Jason didn't call out. He didn't stop him. He just stood there, realizing for the first time that some people live by a different kind of discipline, one that isn't written on the papers he held. And from that moment on, when silence began to force a young man to question himself, the whispers and glances around them slowly shifted direction, signaling that a far greater collision was waiting just ahead. Jason didn't stop at the silence that had just passed. In front of even more people, he spoke again, this time without hiding his contempt. Still that same coat. Who does he think he is? The words dropped into the crowded air, sounding almost casual, yet sharp enough to wound. A few awkward laughs followed, scattered, uncertain. They rose out of habit, the reflex to go along, then faded quickly, as if even those laughing realized they had stepped past a blurred line. Samuel stopped. He didn't turn right away. He stood still for a brief moment, just long enough for the words to pass behind him. His hand gently pulled his collar up, covering the faded patch. It wasn't an act of avoidance. It was the way he protected something sacred from being dragged into mockery. Then he lowered his head ever so slightly, like a greeting offered to the empty space ahead, where the faces of those he had never forgotten still seemed to stand. From a distance, Henry Cole straightened his back. He was older than Samuel, slower in his walk, but his gesture held no hesitation. Henry raised his hand in salute. Clean, proper, unadorned. It wasn't a response to ridicule, it was recognition of a man. In that moment, everything seemed to pause. Not everyone understood, but those who had once worn a uniform understood immediately. They saw what words didn't need to explain. Samuel returned the gesture with a nod. Not deep, not long, just right. Enough to say he had seen it, understood it, and honored it. The two old men didn't exchange a single word yet. In that brief instant, they shared more than the surrounding crowd could grasp. It was a language that exists only between those who once stood together in days when life was more fragile than any promise. Jason witnessed it all. He saw the raised arm. He saw the bowed head. But he didn't understand. To him, it looked like a strange ritual, an outdated reflex, a display that didn't belong there. He didn't know that some salutes aren't meant for present rank, but for what was paid for with blood and time. He didn't know that some symbols grow more sacred with age and should never be named lightly. Around them, the crowd began to shift in a different way. Not cheap curiosity anymore, but the unease of people realizing they were standing before something far more serious than their earlier jokes. A few eyes followed Samuel as he moved on. No one laughed now. No one added another word. The familiar noise of a gathering slowly gave way to a silence that was hard to name. Samuel walked on his back, slightly bent, his steps steady. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. What needed to be preserved had been preserved. What needed to be answered had been answered. The rest no longer belonged to him. Henry lowered his hand slowly. He let out a long breath, like a man who had finally completed a duty he had carried for a very long time. Jason stood there, the certainty he'd relied on beginning to fracture. He didn't know exactly what had just happened, only that the crowd was no longer standing with the laughter. Another kind of silence was forming now, unlike the one in the cafe. This one was heavier, collective. It carried a sense of anticipation, as if someone or something was about to arrive and put everything back where it truly belonged. And as the seats were arranged and the flags set straight, that feeling condensed into the shape of a formal ceremony, one where every word would soon have to stand face to face with a truth it could no longer avoid. The memorial ceremony officially began in an atmosphere unlike the moments before it. Everything had been arranged, yet the crowd's breathing had not settled. Jason stood at the coordination point, his hand gripping the stack of papers, his mouth reading familiar lines, while his mind kept drifting back to what had just happened. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the tension showed in every pause. This was the ceremony he was responsible for. This was the moment he was supposed to be in control. And it was precisely then that he felt that control slipping away. Jason cleared his throat and introduced the guest of honor for the day. We are honored to welcome General Helen Carter. The name was spoken with the necessary formality, carrying the weight of decades of service. The crowd focused immediately. Scattered conversations stopped. Eyes turned forward. In that moment, Jason believed things were returning to their proper course. As soon as he finished saying her name, he let out a small breath, as if the familiar ritual could pull him free from the unease clinging to him. Helen Carter appeared, her stride firm, her gaze sharp and composed. She stepped forward along the prepared path, each step certain as though she had walked this road countless times before. The crowd straightened slightly. No one needed to prompt them. Everyone could feel the presence of someone who required no lengthy introduction to command respect. Jason turned ready to move on to the next part, convinced that his role here was complete. Then everything stopped. Helen Carter did not take another step. She stood still midway, not out of hesitation, but because she had seen something that made it impossible to continue with the prepared script. Her eyes moved away from the front rows, traveling farther back to the edge, where an old man sat quietly. Samuel. He did not look up. His hands rested neatly on the top of his cane, his back straight in the way of those long accustomed to holding posture, even when no one is watching. A faint ripple of unease spread. No one spoke it aloud, yet everyone sensed that something was no longer unfolding as expected. Jason felt the shift first, from behind him. He turned and caught Helen Carter's gaze fixed on a point he did not yet understand. The ceremonial smile on his face faltered. One beat, then another. No words were spoken, but the waiting grew heavy. Helen Carter turned, not back toward the platform. She stepped down. No one asked her to. No one guided her. She moved straight through the open space between the rows, heading toward Samuel. Those standing nearby instinctively stepped aside, as if they understood that a path was being opened, not for a ritual, but for a truth. Jason froze. Every prepared line in his mind slipped away. He no longer controlled the rhythm of the ceremony. And for the first time that day, he realized that power does not always belong to the person holding the microphone. Samuel remained seated. He did not turn. He did not stand. He made no preparation at all, as though he were accustomed to the most important moments arriving without warning. Helen Carter stopped in front of him. The distance between them was close enough to need no call. The crowd held its breath. The murmurs fell silent. The noise of the earlier moments no longer had a place. Jason watched his heart beating faster. He understood that something was happening, though he did not yet know what it was. He only knew that from the moment Helen Carter left the place prepared for her, the familiar order had been broken. What was about to follow no longer belonged to introductions, printed scripts, or carefully prepared speeches. It belonged to a symbol that had just been seen, and to an answer that none of them could stop. And when Helen Carter came to a full stop before Samuel, the entire ceremony seemed to tilt by a single beat, signaling that recognition was about to occur in a way no one had ever planned for. General Carter stopped in front of Samuel. She stood straight close enough that no name needed to be spoken. In that moment, no one else existed between them. She raised her hand in a formal military salute, clean, precise, without excess. It was not a gesture of courtesy, but an acknowledgement that could not be taken back. A salute meant for a man who had stood in the right place when he needed to stand, and had kept silent at the right time when silence mattered most. The crowd reacted almost at once. Those who had been seated rose to their feet. No one signaled them. No one waited for an order. They stood because their bodies understood before their minds could catch up. The murmurs vanished. Awkward smiles dissolved. A gravity spread quickly and decisively like a quiet wave. In that air, there was no room left for cheap curiosity or careless jokes. General Carter lowered her hand. Her voice carried clearly, not loud, not soft, but steady enough for every word to land. That patch was issued to only 5 men. She paused for a beat. He is the last. The statement needed no further explanation. It did not embellish. It did not perform. It stood there like a truth that had waited a long time to be spoken in the right place. Jason froze. The papers in his hand slipped slightly, then stopped. Every prepared thought in his mind shattered. There were no more questions, no more justifications. He looked at the patch he had once dismissed, and for the first time felt an unnamed hollow open in his chest. No one laughed now. No one dared to breathe loudly. The eyes turned toward Samuel carried no judgment anymore, only a quiet respect overdue and unavoidable. Samuel remained still for a brief moment. He looked at General Carter, his expression unchanged, neither seeking recognition nor turning away from it. Then he stood, slowly, unhurried, not trying to make an impression. He raised his hand in return. The motion was not as sharp as hers, but it was certain familiar, as if his body still remembered clearly what his memory had long set aside. He said nothing more. There was no need. What needed to be said had been spoken for him long ago through what he had done through his steady presence year after year. That moment lasted longer than any protocol, not because of time, but because of meaning. Some people bowed their heads, some placed a hand over their hearts. Someone swallowed hard. Someone quietly wiped away something that had just risen. Recognition had occurred not loudly, but in a way that made it impossible to return to who they had been before. Jason finally lifted his head. His eyes no longer avoided the truth. They carried the shame of someone who had realized he had seen wrong, and the confusion of someone who had not yet fully grasped what he had just witnessed. He did not step forward. He did not intrude. He simply stood there, silent, letting the truth pass through him, like a cold wind he should have felt much earlier. General Carter looked at Samuel once more briefly, as if to say she understood why he had chosen silence. Then she turned away. The crowd remained standing. No one sat down right away. Recognition had been placed where it belonged, but the story behind it had not yet been told. The names, the dates, the things that had happened for that patch to exist. All of it was still there, untold, untouched. And as everyone stood within that newly awakened silence, a sense of waiting began to spread, signaling that the truth behind the patch was about to be spoken piece by piece, inevitably. General Carter didn't say much. She didn't need to. Those who had been there understood that some stories grow heavier the shorter they are. She scanned the crowd once, then turned back to Samuel. Her voice didn't tremble, but there was a deliberate slowness to it, as if every word had to be placed exactly where it belonged. She spoke of a mission that had taken place long ago in a place with no name on ordinary maps. A mission where 5 men were chosen not because they were better than others, but because they were willing to go where others could not. There were no unnecessary details, no dates or times. Just the bare truth: the mission was completed, but not everyone came home. The patch did not exist to be shown off, it existed to remember, to remind that some costs are never refunded. In the crowd, an older man lowered his head slightly. He didn't need to hear more. The moment General Carter mentioned the patch, he knew. His shoulders sagged, not from fatigue, but from memory being summoned back. He had seen it before in days when death stood so close it no longer needed to be named. He understood why Samuel had never spoken. He understood why the patch was always kept covered. Not far away, Jason stood frozen. He heard every word, yet they didn't immediately form a complete story in his mind. He understood that this was something far larger than he had imagined, but he didn't know where to begin asking. His throat went dry. Every question suddenly felt unnecessary. For the first time, he felt as though he were standing before a door that, once crossed, would no longer allow him to see the world the same way again. General Carter stopped. She didn't continue. She didn't need to. Truth doesn't always have to be complete to be understood. Sometimes knowing that it happened is enough. She looked at Samuel and gave a very slight nod, as if handing back the right to speak to the man who had carried this story for years without opening his mouth. Samuel stood there, his back straight. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked into the empty space ahead where familiar faces from memory might still be standing somewhere. He spoke only one sentence. His voice was low, not loud, but clear. It belongs to those who didn't come back. Nothing more, nothing less. Not a single wasted word. The sentence didn't explain, but it placed everything exactly where it belonged. No one applauded. No one knew how to respond. And perhaps that was the right response. Silence spread dense and firm. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of acceptance. Some people bowed their heads deeper. Some clenched their hands. Someone looked down at the ground, as if realizing for the first time that they were standing on layers of history that had never been quiet. Jason swallowed. He looked at Samuel, then at the patch he had once mocked. Now it was no longer an old piece of fabric. It was the trace of names no one called out loud anymore. He wanted to say something, but there were no words that felt right. The silence forced him to stay with that feeling, without escaping into justification. General Carter stepped back a single pace. No one signaled for what came next. The ceremony seemed to slow, to grow heavier. What needed to arrive had arrived. The truth no longer stood at the edges, it was in the center now, forcing everyone present to face it directly. And within that silence, each person began to understand that this story did not end with recognition. It demanded something else, something far more difficult. Because once the truth has been spoken, and no one can turn away, the remaining question is no longer, who is he? It is, how will we live with this from here on? After the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving behind empty spaces no one had noticed before. Jason remained for a long time. He watched the direction Samuel walked toward, then finally decided to step forward. There was no microphone anymore, no stack of papers, no role to cling to. Just a young man facing something he had understood too late. Jason called out to him, his voice much lower than before. Samuel stopped. He turned, his expression calm, neither probing nor avoiding. Jason stood straight, but his shoulders sagged. He apologized, Not at length, not with detours, not with explanations. Just a complete apology spoken with the shame of someone who realized he had been wrong from the very beginning. Samuel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't sigh. He didn't frown. When Jason finished, Samuel gave a very slight nod. "You just didn't know," he said, his voice even neither raised nor lowered. "Now you do." There was no reproach in the words, no sense of granting forgiveness. Just a truth placed where it belonged, the way he had placed everything for many years. They stood beside each other for a brief moment. Neither rushed to speak. Samuel looked toward the remaining headstones where the names lay silent as they always had. Jason followed his gaze. This time he wasn't looking with curiosity, but with something closer to respect. He asked very softly why Samuel came back every year. Samuel didn't turn. He answered as if speaking to himself. "Because I can still stand here." The sentence was simple, yet heavy enough to carry the weight of those who no longer could. Samuel spoke briefly. There were no details of heroics, no mention of danger. He only said that returning each year was a quiet roll call, not to be remembered himself, but to make sure those who had fallen were not forgotten. He said that some promises don't need to be repeated. They only need to be kept. Jason listened, his head bowed. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to soften what he was feeling. For the first time, he understood that some stories don't need to be fully told to be complete. Jason lowered his head. Not in a ceremonial bow, but in recognition. He didn't justify what he had said. He didn't claim ignorance as an excuse. He let silence do the rest. Samuel looked at him once more, not to forgive, but to confirm that the apology had been placed where it belonged. Then he turned away, walking slowly and evenly the way he had walked through each year. Jason stood there for a long time. He didn't call after him. He didn't try to prolong the moment. Something in his mind had shifted position. He understood that an apology was only the beginning. What mattered more was what he would do after turning away. The rules, the words, the looks that once seemed harmless. All of it needed to be reconsidered, not out of fear of being wrong, but because he now understood what was right. Samuel disappeared from view. He carried no sense of victory with him, only the quiet steadiness of someone who had finished the day's work. Jason took a deep breath. He knew he still had much to learn, but at least from that day on, he knew where to begin. And as the two men went in different directions, the lesson did not remain in the apology that had just been spoken. It moved silently with Jason as he walked on, preparing to become a real change. Some time passed quietly without announcements or fanfare. The changes came slowly, but they endured much like the way Samuel had returned to this place year after year. The rules for the memorial ceremony were revised. No longer did priority belong only to paperwork or registration lists. Those who had cared for the cemetery over many years, those who showed up faithfully when no one was watching, were given their rightful place. Not to honor individuals, but to acknowledge a simple truth: some contributions don't live in records, yet they keep memory from being erased. Jason was the one who placed the small sign at the entrance. Just a few words, simply carved, no decoration. Remember them. He didn't sign it. He didn't explain it. He knew the sign wasn't meant for Samuel alone, but for every name that had been wiped clean of dust by those aging hands. This was how he chose to live, with the lesson he had learned, not by repeating an apology, but through an action small enough to avoid spectacle and large enough that it couldn't be ignored. Samuel continued to return. Not earlier. Not later. He still wore the old jacket. The patch was still there, faded, neither more carefully hidden nor more openly displayed. It existed exactly as it always had. It asked for no attention. It demanded no recognition. It was simply there alongside the man who had carried it through a lifetime of silence. One morning, as Samuel walked along his familiar path, a child stopped. The child didn't know his name, didn't know the story behind the patch. He only saw an elderly man walking slowly, gentle-eyed, steady-footed. The child raised both hands in a salute, awkward but earnest. No one had taught him to do it. Samuel stopped. He lowered his head and returned very slightly. A brief moment, yet enough to plant something that needed no explanation. Jason stood not far away. He saw everything. He didn't step closer. He didn't intervene. He understood that some moments don't belong to him. He simply stood still, letting the image carve itself into memory. In his mind, the question was no longer who deserves to be honored, but who stayed long enough to no longer need to be named. The patch appeared one last time in this story. Still worn, still silent, untouched, unexplained. It needed no narration because what it represented had already passed through enough eyes. It carried names no longer spoken aloud, promises never written down, footsteps that had stopped in places history often only glances at. Samuel left the way he always did, without looking back, without leaving any sign that he expected more. What needed to be kept had been kept. What needed to be passed on had been passed on not through a long story, but through a presence steady enough to change how others saw. Honor does not require grand ceremonies. It does not live in meticulously planned events or perfectly timed applause. Honor lives in how people behave when no one forces them to do the right thing. It lives in small decisions, in bows given at the right moment, in actions repeated even when there is no recognition. And when the story closes, what remains is not a dramatic climax, but a quiet transformation. A small sign, a new rule, a child learning to salute with both hands, a young man learning to be silent before judging, and a veteran who keeps walking, carrying the past of many so the present does not forget them. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Brave Veteran Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,